So we've got the particles moving in the direction we want. We've got them randomized in size so that they don't all look the same. Next, we should probably focus on their color before refining things like the turbulence and the wind in the scene. Just like we set the particle scale, we have setters that also set the particle color. We can again initialize the color, but since we're concerned with the color after the second frame, we would likely set the particle color as an attribute at the base of the ice tree. So after we set the scale, let's make ourselves a port for color. I'll right click on the scale port and insert a port after. And if we look under our setters, we can set the particle color. And again, this will accept an RGB input and execute directly into a port of the ice tree. So I can execute that. So if I actually play right now, you should see the particle color has been set to red, or whatever the color is inside of here. Blue, sorry. I was looking at the color input widget. So rather than setting the particle color to a constant value, we can actually use some modifiers. So let's say modify particle color or randomize color by gradient. I can actually just go in and randomize each particle's color using a sampling from a gradient. So actually I'm going to take this compound and drag it into my graph. If we just explore it for a moment before I fit it into my tree, it is a compound because it's surrounded by these double lines, and if I edit it, you can see it's a very simple compound. It's simply just a gradient compound that if I double click on it, it composes of a gradient and the different presets you can use. Most people familiar with XSI have seen this before, but what's driving the input of the gradient is a randomize function. So it's just randomly distributing the particles, each particle's ID, with a certain color from the gradient. Again, what's being taken from there. So the values right now are a min-max between 0 and 1, and that's the range of an RGB slider color, and you can see that it is set to animated. We actually have a compound connection here to be able to control that animated feature, and that's why when you actually look, there is an animated toggle as well. So this animated toggle is actually driving the randomize value by range animated feature. And we'll talk more about compounds and exposing inputs as we go along. For now, let's not leave this animated. We'll actually eventually turn it on. But we need to actually set the color. So I'm actually going to move my compound here. Just make room by moving some other branches. I'll move the add forces compound down. And I'll input the randomized color by gradient, output the randomized color by gradient into the input of the set particle color compound. Now when I hit play, the particles all assume a color from the sampling set I've chosen. And so if I stop this, just save my scene before I go on, I'm going to go ahead and change the colors that are being sampled from the gradient. So let's go and choose like a very bright white, almost close to 100% white. I'll take this green slider and I'll give it maybe a kind of a gray, and maybe we'll just try and get some blues in there as well too. A little bit of blue. Let's add a touch of blue into here, and maybe a little bit right there. So again, if I hit play now, the color range is much more muted. Of course, you know, I can switch the colors and you can see that it works. So I'm just going to try and just make subtle variations here in the colors, just to add a little bit more interest. So we now have our separated colors. Again, if I just go back in and I turn the animated feature on, we're actually getting a little bit of flicker to the particles as well. So that's something that's kind of interesting. It's a little bit too poppy, if you get my drift. It's just sort of a toggle rather than a smooth transition. So we could probably do a Turbulize color by gradient as well. If I output that, you know, we could do something like that, and again, smoothly animating the transition over time as opposed to randomizing between the three colors. So here I could even just take an additional color widget just by clicking, and setting my three colors to transition between. Maybe I'll go between blue as the most blue color is my middle color. So if it is cycling, it's actually cycling through the four colors on off, or light blue, more gray, light blue, more gray. I'll take the base color around here, sort of a 80% white, and the topmost color in my gradient at position 1 at about 88, and I'll just tint a little bit of blue in there. Okay, so if I hit play now, I am getting a smooth animation between those colors, and I can use that smooth animation later on to help when I'm using mental ray displacements and transparency in the compositor. So now we've controlled our color as well as the particle scale. So I've decided not to go with the randomized color. I'll delete that, and we'll clean up our graph a little bit. So our tree is growing, and we've started to define our ice simulation with a little more detail. And now we're going to go in and start to fine-tune the movement of the particles using some wind and turbulence vectors.